Well, this is an introduction to the series about Christian Zionism and our friend Amir Tsarfati, particularly just to explain where I'm coming from, sort of like what is my background and how I relate to this issue. So basically, I grew up in the Soviet Union as a secular Jew, also kind of, I would say, Russo-Ukrainian secular Jew, because Jewish culture was very adulterated in the Soviet Union. It wasn't particularly religious at all, and it was really in the Russo-Ukrainian culture, specifically in the Ukrainian context. Had it been in the Soviet Union, in the Russian Federation, for example, I would have said it was just a Russian Soviet secular Jew, something like that. Anyway, so but through my upbringing, nevertheless, I was able to sort of understand the underpinnings of Zionism a little bit. I listened a lot to Soviet propaganda about that. In fact, the funny bit is the Soviet propaganda actually didn't lie all that much about Zionism as it turned out, although they did lie about a few other things. And so I gained insights from this purely secular perspective. I had no idea about the religious underpinning of it at all. And so I did cover some of this, sort of like in my first book. Link in comments. Here's my first book. This is really more about Russo-Ukrainian conflict than anything else. But I did consider um, the story of the Jews among the Russians and Ukrainians in the whole region over the centuries. So that kind of reflects my understanding, my personal experiences as I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. In fact, in the late 80s, I was actually considering immigrating to Israel because Israel was a much better economic opportunity than the Soviet Union at that time. And in fact, I would vouch to say that probably vast majority of Soviet Jews who immigrated to Israel in their late 80s and early 90s and throughout the 90s probably were uh, really not induced by any sort of religious feelings or even the feelings of any kind of secular Zionism as much as economics. And this is continuing to this day probably because there's still some Jews who immigrate from the former Soviet republics. Now, in 1991, I became a Christian, and right away I sort of discovered the entire new field of Zionism, which was religious Zionism, particularly Christian Zionism. And at first I was very interested, of course, because that kind of spoke to my background, but also made me understand some other things about Zionism which were not apparent to me before. And so there I went. I was sort of like engaged, in various missions and Christian missions and different work. And one of those missions I engaged in was Jews for Jesus, which is basically an evangelical Jewish organization that advances the gospel among the Jews. Well, this is not the easy line of work. In fact, they're heavily despised and even dismissed as Jews by majority of the Jews. In fact, their organizations created with the entire purpose to combat what Jews for Jesus are trying to do. In fact, nevertheless, somehow Jews for Jesus managed to be just as Zionist as everybody else. And sort of this kind of led me to think about more and more about this topic. And eventually I came to the conclusion that Zionism is completely incompatible with Christianity. Because Zionism, effectively, it's an ethno supremacy. It's an ideology of ethno supremacy. In the particular region, okay, but nevertheless, it's ethno supremacy. In other words, you have the right to some land at the expense of everyone else. In other words, you can ethnically cleanse them, you can get rid of them, you can disregard them, you don't have to give them rights, you can occupy them, but because the Bible said, presumably, allegedly, Bible said something along the lines that you're entitled to this piece of land. And of course, after what happened on October 7th, I mean, became all the more apparent with every month that passed, with every day that passed, with every 100,000, 10,000 extra Palestinians killed. And so as a result, I wrote another book, just also link in comments. This is called The Christian Zionism and Deconstruction. And So a general, but having said that, I have been involved in some congregations that unfortunately Christian Zionist congregations in Christianity, and I came to the conclusion that generally Christian Zionists in the West tend to be well-meaning people who have simply been misinformed by their leaders and their pastors. But the people who are in charge are clearly aware of the consequences of their theology and politics, which is one of them say. The polity, no matter what the Christian Zionist leader might tell you, that somehow what he believes about the Jewish people versus what the state of Israel is doing or state of Israel is are two different things. Don't believe them. They all support the state of Israel, some perhaps with some reservations, but most of them without reservations. And given that Zionism is really a weak ideological position, historically, theologically, for example, how the North American Christian community was built up on Zionism and Scofield Bible. Scofield Bible is extremely shoddy work, which I show in my book. So, with weak foundations as it is, secular, religious, political, Zionist story is stitched through a series of personally presented narratives, and none works better than when presented by so-called real Jews, okay? And it's understandable considering the peculiarities of Christianity and the modern state of Israel. In other words, having a Hebrew accent does magic to capture audience across the ocean, okay? And hardly anybody does it better than Amir Tsarfati and his organization Behold Israel. They literally have millions of views on social media. They probably have more than a million subscribers on YouTube. And they're followed religiously, and the word is taken as complete and 100% unadulterated truth by millions of Christian Zionists across the West. My first experience with Amir Tsarfati came in June 2022 when I happened to tune into the local Christian Zionist conference here in Vancouver. And what was interesting is that because prior to that, majority of Christian Zionists, fundamentalists in Canada and in the United States, opposed various COVID measures, including the vaccinations, lockdowns, church closures, and everything else like that. It was just coincidence. So. And here comes Amir Tsarfati, and right in their faces called them fools, and said they should accept the lockdowns, they should accept the church closures, they should accept mandatory vaccinations. If this was not enough to sort of raise some questions, at least in my mind, not everybody else's perhaps, then he proceeded in his basically in the first few sentences to call for bombing of the state of Iran, which is maybe a political position, but it certainly goes against any theology that anybody understands about Christianity, or at least what the majority of Christians claim to believe, because they claim to believe in Jesus loving their enemy, in Jesus giving to the poor, in Jesus being a peacemaker. So how in the world can come to the conclusion that this is the call for war and bombing of sovereign countries is a totally normal thing to do? And of course, after October 7th, Amir Tsarfati's social media went on overdrive. So I started following, and I realized how much false, completely unsupported information is trafficked to unsuspecting Christians in the West by Amir Tsarfati, his organization, and a lot of people like him. Therefore, I decided to have a look at one of his sermons that the local Canadian congregation delivered just a few weeks ago. And I wanted to basically, you can find the total sermon in the links below. What I will do also is I will address, I have created about, I don't know, 15, 16 separate snippets of this sermon, and I will address each one separately in a series of videos. And the reason why I've done it so, because Amir Tsarfati, just about every 2 minutes he speaks, there's so many falsehoods are preferred, incorrect information, disinformation, lies to the people he's talking to, completely unsuspecting, that to make a video out of 45 minutes sermon, if I were to make the entire video like this, rebutting everything he said, it will take me another 5 hours. I would like not to tire you with 5 hours of watching me. So therefore decided to sort of partition his video in, as I said, 15, 16 separate pieces, perhaps a bit less. I'm not entirely sure exactly what the number will be. And I will provide comments, and you're welcome to decide whether I'm saying anything that is correct or I'm wrong. You're always welcome to leave the comments. Well, enjoy the series. Thank you very much.